They told me the garden remembers. They didn't tell me it learns. Now the trees outside my window are growing in the shape of my own terrified face. My name is Finn, and I am the ghost in this valley. This is not a rescue log. This is a warning. If you find this recording, run. Don't let it learn your name too. My life before Montana had shrunk to the size of a single cardboard box. It contained a few botany textbooks, a framed and now worthless PhD, a notice of academic probation that felt more like an epitaph, and a single wilting succulent I couldn't bring myself to throw away. It was a monument to my own spectacular failure. The scandal, as they called it, wasn't even dramatic. No stolen research, no dramatic affair. Just a small, pathetic lie. I'd massaged the data on a paper about cellular regeneration in Arctic mosses, nudging the results from inconclusive to promising. I did it for the grant money, for the recognition, for a desperate attempt to claw my way out of the suffocating anonymity of academia. And I got caught. The fallout was quiet but absolute. My name was poison. No university would touch me. My world became a series of part-time jobs. Bookstore clerk, delivery driver, each one a little more soul-crushing than the last. The silence of my empty apartment was louder than any accusation, filled with the ghosts of what might have been. So when the job posting appeared on a niche academic board, so specific it felt like a prank, I applied without a second thought. Winter caretaker, Geobotanical Research Station, Montana Wilds, 6-month contract, high risk, high reward. Doctorate in botany or related field required. Discretion is paramount. It was a life raft, a chance to disappear, to be surrounded by the one thing that had never judged me, plants. The interview process was sterile and remote. A single video call with a woman named Kaylin, her face a professional, dispassionate mask against a corporate grey background. She didn't ask about the scandal. She didn't ask why a botanist with my qualifications would want to be a glorified janitor in the middle of nowhere. She just assessed my knowledge of HVAC systems, hydroponics, and server maintenance. I must have given the right answers, because a week later, I had a signed contract and a plane ticket. The last leg of the journey was a 3-hour drive in a rented truck, climbing deeper into a mountain range that looked like the jagged spine of a sleeping god. The world dissolved into a monochrome palette of white snow, black rock, and grey sky. Then I saw it. The directions led me to the edge of a sheer cliff overlooking a circular valley about a mile in diameter. It was impossible. While the entire world around me was locked in the iron grip of winter, the valley below was a vibrant, steaming emerald green, a perfect circle of summer, thriving in a world of ice. This was Geode Valley. The station itself was a low-slung modernist structure of dark steel and reinforced glass, nestled at the valley's edge. It looked less like a research facility and more like a bunker designed to watch something beautiful and dangerous. I parked the truck, and the moment I stepped out, the air changed. The Arctic chill was gone, replaced by a humid, geothermal warmth that smelled of sulfur, damp earth, and chlorophyll. It was the smell of life, shockingly potent against the sterile cold. Inside, the station was empty. My boots echoed on the polished concrete floors. It was a state-of-the-art facility with a fully equipped lab, living quarters, and a central conservatory filled with samples of the local flora. Everything was clean, orderly, and deeply unnervingly silent. My only contact with the outside world would be Kaylin via a satellite link. My purpose, she'd explained, was simple: keep the station running through the winter, monitor the atmospheric sensors, and perform basic data collection. "The valley takes care of itself, Finn," she'd said. "Your job is to make sure it doesn't take the station with it." My first email from her was waiting in my inbox. The subject line was Acclimation Protocols. It was the list of rules. I opened the attachment, expecting a manual on boiler maintenance and data backup. What I got was different. I read it, then read it again, the low hum of the station's life support system filling the silence. Geode Valley Research Station, Winter Protocols. Rule number 1, all exterior excursions must be logged with a start and end time. Never remain outside for more than 3 hours at a time. Your suit's atmospheric sensors are for your safety. Trust them. Rule number 2, The central geothermal cavern is the heart of the valley. Its entrance is sealed and monitored. Do not attempt to access it. The structural integrity is unknown. Rule number 3. The local flora can exhibit extreme environmental mimetism, replicating the shape, color, and texture of inorganic objects. Catalog any instances with photographs. File ref, MimCat. Do not, under any circumstances, touch a suspected specimen with your bare hands. Rule number 4. All water must be sourced from the station's deep well filtration system. Do not drink from the valley streams. They are chemically pure but biologically active, in ways our filters are not rated for. Rule number 5. If you observe flora growing on the station's exterior, log it and report immediately. Do not attempt to remove it yourself. A remote caustic wash will be initiated. Rule number 6. Do not play recorded music or generate loud, repetitive noises outside the station. The resonant frequencies can cause unexpected and rapid growth patterns. The list went on, but it was rule number 9 that made the hair on my arm stand up. Rule number 9. The nightly release of luminescent spores is a standard containment event. Between 20-06 PO, the station must be in full lockdown mode. All exterior air vents will seal automatically. This is a Class 1 biological precaution. Do not for any reason breathe the outside air during this period. I sat back, a slow unease creeping into my fascination. It was bizarre. Mimetism of inorganic objects, unexpected growth patterns from music, a nightly spore release that required a station-wide lockdown. As a botanist, I tried to rationalize it. This was a unique geothermal ecosystem, an evolutionary island. Extreme adaptations were to be expected. The rules were just an abundance of corporate caution. That had to be it. The first week was a dream. I fell into a routine. My days spent checking gauges, calibrating sensors, and making short-logged excursions into the valley. The place was a botanical wonderland. Ferns that coiled like brass springs, mosses that shimmered with an oily metallic sheen, flowers with petals that looked like spun glass. It was a world untouched, evolving on a completely different path. I felt the old thrill of discovery, the pure academic joy I thought I had lost forever. The silence was a balm on my frayed nerves. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. On the 5th day, I found my first example of rule number 3. Near the edge of a steaming creek, half buried in the rich, dark soil, was a perfect replica of a wrench. It had the heft, the size, the dull brown patina of rust. I almost reached for it before I remembered the rule. I knelt, my camera clicking. Looking closer, I could see it wasn't metal. The rust was a fine velvety mold, and the body of the tool had a faint fibrous texture. It was a fungus that had grown into the flawless shape of a tool someone must have dropped years ago. I uploaded the photos, labeled MimCat001. My scientific mind was buzzing. The organism must have encountered the wrench and incorporated its mineral composition into its structure, using the object as a perfect mold. A 1 in a million chance. A beautiful, statistical anomaly. I filed the report and tried to put the inherent strangeness of it out of my mind. That night I experienced rule number 9 for the first time. At 19:59, the station came alive with a low thud as heavy magnetic locks engaged on the vents and doors. A soft, computerized voice announced, "Containment protocol initiated, all clear." I stood in the main observation dome, a cup of tea warming my hands, and looked out into the twilight. It started subtly, a faint glimmer in the air like dust motes catching the last rays of sun. But as darkness fell completely, the valley transformed. The air began to fill with light. Billions upon billions of tiny spores, each one a pinprick of soft, greenish-blue luminescence, were rising from the valley floor. It wasn't a chaotic cloud. It moved with a strange, languid grace, like a river of starlight flowing upwards. It was the single most beautiful and awe-inspiring natural phenomenon I had ever witnessed. I stood there for an hour, mesmerized as the silent, glittering blizzard filled the entire valley. The station was an island in a sea of ghostly light. I pressed my face closer to the thick, reinforced glass, wanting to be out there, to feel it, to analyze it. And that's when I heard it. It wasn't a sound in the traditional sense. It was a pressure in my ears, a vibration that seemed to travel through the glass and into the bones of my skull. A faint, dry, whispering sound. A sibilant hiss layered 1,000,000 times over. It was the sound of sand being poured onto silk, the sound of autumn leaves skittering across pavement, the sound of 1,000,000 tiny, clicking, chittering things all communicating at once. The beautiful, silent light show was not silent at all. The spores were talking. I stood frozen, my tea forgotten, the warmth in my hands replaced by an invasive, bone-deep chill. I looked out at that impossible garden, at the beautiful, deadly, whispering light, and for the first time, I felt a primal, gut-wrenching fear. The rules on that list weren't about corporate caution. They were about survival. The silence of this valley was a lie, and I had just begun to hear what it was hiding. I'm documenting everything, every single rule, every impossible event that happens here. If you want to see where this leads, if you want to help me figure out what this place is, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment below. I have a feeling the strangeness in Geode Valley is just getting started. Sleep did not offer an escape. It offered only a continuation. I dreamt of that whispering light, of the spores flowing through me not like a blizzard, but like blood through new veins. I dreamt I was a tree, my roots deep in the warm, sulphurous earth, my leaves unfurling to a sky I couldn't see, and I was humming a silent, multi-billion-part harmony with everything else that grew. I woke up with a gasp, the phantom sensation of chlorophyll in my lungs, the station's recycled air feeling thin and dead by comparison. The morning light filtering through the dome's windows seemed different now, less a promise of a new day and more the slow opening of a single colossal eye. The valley's beauty had become a mask, and I was now terrified of what lay beneath. The rules were no longer a curiosity, they were a catechism. My days transformed into a series of obsessive rituals dictated by Kaylin's email. I would log my excursions down to the second. I'd run triple diagnostics on the airlock seals before the 8 p.m. lockdown. I treated the station not as a laboratory, but as a deep-sea submersible, and the vibrant world outside was the crushing, abyssal pressure. The line between scientific caution and outright paranoia had been erased. For 2 weeks, the valley played coy. I saw nothing more anomalous than the wrench fungus. I catalogued a flower whose petals had the exact crystalline structure of snowflake dendrites, impossible in this geothermal heat, and a vine that had grown in a perfect repeating spiral that mirrored the Fibonacci sequence with unnerving mathematical precision. These were marvels, yes, but they were explainable, at least in the abstract. They were examples of a biology that followed its own bizarre logic. I started to wonder if I had imagined the sound in the spores, if the isolation was getting to me. I began to hope that the wrench was just a fluke, the peak of the valley's strangeness. The valley, it seemed, did not appreciate being underestimated. It was a Tuesday. I had a specific routine for my morning coffee. I used a heavy ceramic mug, navy blue, a cheap souvenir from a long-forgotten seaside trip. It had a small, distinctive chip on the rim near the handle, a tiny white crescent in the blue glaze. I would often take it with me on my short morning patrol of the station's perimeter, the warmth a small comfort against the unsettling landscape. That morning, I set the mug down on the exterior railing of the main deck for just a minute while I retied my bootlace. I finished my patrol, went back inside, and thought nothing more of it. 3 days later, I was on a geological survey 50 yards from the station, collecting soil samples near a cluster of the metallic sheened mosses. My eyes were on the ground, so I almost missed it. Tucked at the base of a steaming fissure, nestled amongst the ferns, was an object. It was navy blue. I cautiously approached, my heart beginning a low, heavy thud against my ribs. It was a mug. It was my mug. I knelt, my breath held tight in my chest. The shape was perfect. The handle, the size, the slight curve of its body, all identical. And there, on the rim, was the chip. A tiny, perfect, white crescent rendered in a pale, chalky lichen. I raised my hand, my fingers trembling, stopping an inch from its surface as rule number 3 screamed in my mind. Do not touch. It wasn't ceramic. Like the wrench, it was some kind of dense fungal growth. The blue color derived from a startlingly accurate bioluminescence that mimicked the glaze. I felt a wave of vertigo, the world tilting on its axis. This was not a coincidence. This was not a one-in-a-million chance encounter between an organism and a dropped object. The wrench had been there for years, maybe decades. But my mug had been on that railing for less than 60 seconds, 3 days ago. The implications washed over me in a cold, sickening tide. The valley had seen it. It had registered the shape, the color, the specific, unique flaw of my mug, and it had replicated it. It had printed a copy. The spores, I realized with a sudden, horrifying clarity. The nightly blizzard of light. It wasn't just a reproductive mechanism. It was a reconnaissance network. A biological LiDAR system scanning the entire valley every single night, absorbing every new detail. And then the valley. The valley grew the new information into its very fabric. My presence here wasn't just tolerated. It was being studied. I was a new data set, a foreign object introduced into the ecosystem, and the superorganism was actively, deliberately learning me. The wrench fungus wasn't a fluke. It was the valley's calling card. This is what we do, it had said. We see, we copy, we become. From that day on, the silence of the station was gone, replaced by the deafening roar of my own thoughts. I felt naked, exposed. Every step I took, every object I touched, every breath I exhaled was being recorded, analyzed, and potentially replicated. I started to see patterns everywhere. A patch of slime mold on a rock would seem to vaguely resemble the shape of the satellite dish on the roof. The veins on a broad, waxy leaf would look suspiciously like the schematic for the station's water pump I'd been studying the night before. Was I imagining it? Was paranoia taking root? Or was the valley simply getting better at mimicking me? I became a ghost in my own life, trying to leave no trace. I ate nutrient paste directly from the packets to avoid using plates. I wore the same clothes every day to avoid introducing new patterns. I covered the windows in my sleeping quarters with blackout panels, but it was useless. The spores saw everything. The next escalation came a week later. It was more subtle, but infinitely more terrifying. I had a habit of doodling when I was processing data logs, complex geometric mazes on a digital notepad. It was a mindless activity to keep my hands busy. I never saved them. One evening, after finishing my reports, I went to the small hydroponics bay in the conservatory to check on the control samples, normal earth plants we were growing as a baseline. There, in the sterile tray of perfectly normal radishes, one of the plants was wrong. Its broad green leaves were covered in pale yellow lines. I leaned in closer, my blood turning to ice water. The lines weren't a sign of disease. They were a pattern. A perfect vein-for-vein recreation of the maze I had been doodling less than an hour earlier. It had copied something that had only existed for a few minutes on a digital screen inside the station. How? How could it possibly know? The spores were outside. Had they found a way in? Was there a breach in the containment? I spent the next 48 hours in a frantic, sleepless haze, running diagnostics on every seal, every filter, every seam in the station's hull. I found nothing. No leaks. No contamination. The station was secure. The only possible conclusion was worse than any breach. The organism didn't need to get in. Its perception wasn't limited to sight. It was something else. Was it sensing the electronic signals from my notepad? The faint heat signature my fingers left on the screen? Or was it something far more invasive? Was it sensing the pattern directly from my mind? The thought was so monstrous, I almost laughed, a hysterical bark of sound that echoed unnervingly in the sterile lab. The flora wasn't just mimicking my objects anymore, it was mimicking my thoughts. The valley was no longer a beautiful prison. It was a living mind, and it was methodically, patiently, and flawlessly mapping the contours of my own. I wasn't just a caretaker in a research station, I was a specimen in a petri dish, and the culture was growing all around me, learning to look, sound, and think exactly like me. The real horror wasn't what I could see happening outside my window. It was the dawning realization of what this research was for. It wasn't about studying the valley. It was about the valley studying us. And I felt with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I was not the first specimen to be catalogued. A new, desperate question began to eclipse all others. What happens when the copying is complete? What happens when this place has learned everything it wants to learn from me? The image of the wrench fungus flashed in my mind, an object replicated, then left to rot. The final stage of mimicry isn't flattery, it's replacement. The radish stared back at me. Its leaves, etched with the phantom of my idle thoughts, were not just a violation, they were a declaration. The invisible boundary between my mind and this valley had been breached, and the silence in the station was no longer a comfort, but the sound of a predator holding its breath. For hours, I did nothing. I sat at the central console, the image of the patterned leaf burned into my retinas, caught in a feedback loop of disbelief and terror. How? It was the only word my brain could form, a useless, repetitive mantra against a tide of impossible facts. My scientific training, the very foundation of my identity, was screaming for data, for a hypothesis, for any rational explanation that didn't involve telepathic plant life. Sabotage. A prank by Kalen using some hidden high-resolution projector to burn the image onto the leaf. Micro-drones in the ventilation system? I entertained each theory, each one more convoluted and absurd than the last, clinging to them like a drowning man to driftwood. But deep down I knew. The chilling elegance of the explanation I was avoiding was the most terrifying part of all. The simplest answer was that the organism was listening, not with ears but with something far more fundamental. My contract, my rules, my purpose here, it was all a lie. I wasn't here to maintain a facility. I was an experiments variable, and if I was going to survive, I needed to see the research. My access level was Caretaker Tier 1, a digital leash that kept me locked out of anything truly important. Core research data, previous project logs, personnel files. It was a child's eye view of a slaughterhouse. That had to change. My second life before botany had been as a teenage computer nerd. I'd never been a malicious hacker, just endlessly curious about how systems worked, how they could be bent. It had been years, but the muscle memory was still there. That night, as the luminescent spores began their silent, whispering patrol outside, I turned my full attention to the station's central server. It was a black box, sleek and humming, the digital heart of this place. Kalen and her faceless corporation were on the other side of a satellite link, but the raw data, the history, had to be stored locally. It was a fortress, but every fortress has a flaw. For 2 days I barely ate or slept. I drank bitter, recycled coffee and hammered away at the command line interface, my world shrinking to the green glow of the terminal. I was searching for a ghost, a backdoor left by a previous user, a forgotten diagnostic tool. On the third night I found it, a maintenance protocol left active by an IT technician, a tiny digital crack in a monolithic wall. A surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, shot through me. I slipped through the crack. I was in. The file structure that opened up before me was vast, a labyrinth of project folders, encrypted data streams, and decades of archived logs. Most of it was gibberish, locked behind security I couldn't possibly break. But one section was different. It was a user archive, a local backup of a personnel drive. The folder was labeled Thorn A. Lead Geobotanist. My predecessor. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The first files I opened were what I expected. Research proposals, atmospheric data charts, chemical analyses of soil samples. Dr. Aris Thorn was brilliant. Her notes were precise, her logic impeccable. She was leagues beyond me, and her initial fascination with the valley mirrored my own, but on a much higher level. She was the one who coined the term systemic mimetism. She saw the wrench fungus not as a copy, but as a biological absorption of inorganic data. She was mesmerized, a scientist standing before a new kingdom of life. I scrolled through months of her logs, each one a time-stamped entry in a digital journal. Log entry 214B. Date 10/14 to 2048. Initial mimetism appears to be contact-based. The organism requires a physical template. However, I'm observing instances of replication at a distance, approx 5 meters. Hypothesis: the nocturnal spore network is not merely reproductive. It functions as a distributed sensory array, using wide-spectrum scanning to map topographical and compositional data. The valley is, in effect, creating a complete 3D model of itself every 24 hours. The sheer processing power required is staggering. It suggests a level of biological organization I've never encountered. Her wonder was palpable, infectious. For a moment, I felt it with her, the pure academic thrill. Then, I kept reading. The tone began to change. Her clinical detachment started to fray at the edges, replaced by an obsessive, almost feverish energy. She was pushing the boundaries, designing experiments that my sanitized list of rules expressly forbade. Log entry 301G. Date 01/22/2049 experiment. 7C. Auditory input. The rule about loud repetitive noise is not for safety, it's to prevent data contamination. I broadcasted a 440 Hz sine wave for 1 hour at the valley's northern edge. The response was immediate. The surrounding flora began to exhibit crystalline growths that vibrated at a sympathetic frequency. The organism doesn't just see, it hears. It translates sound waves into morphogenesis. It physically becomes the sounds it perceives. What would happen if it heard a language, a symphony? I found an audio file attached to that log. I put on my headphones and clicked play. It was a low, resonant hum, almost a chant, coming from the plants themselves. It was beautiful and deeply, fundamentally wrong. I was listening to a forest sing a single, perfect note. I scrolled faster, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I was no longer just reading research. I was watching a mind slowly fall into an abyss. She started referring to the valley not as an ecosystem, but as the intelligence or the host. Then I found the log that explained everything. Log entry 412A, date 05/11/2049. There was an incident. A seismic tremor compromised the northern airlock during the 8 p.m. spore release. A full containment breach. I was outside attempting a manual override. My suit was compromised, a tear in the glove's seam. Exposure was minimal, less than 5 seconds before the inner seal engaged. I inhaled some of them. I'm in full medical quarantine now. Physical vitals are stable. No biological contaminants detected in my bloodstream. Kaylin has been unhelpful. She's more concerned about the integrity of the long-term project data than my well-being. She told me to document any and all anomalous sensory experiences. This is no longer an external observation. The experiment has come inside. Her logs after that point became different. The scientific rigor was still there, but it was interwoven with something deeply personal and terrified. They were no longer just research notes. They were the diary of a transformation. Log entry 415C, date 05/14/2049, 3 days post-exposure. No physical symptoms, but something is wrong with my senses. The station's water filtration system. I can hear it. Not just the hum of the pump, but the actual movement of water through the pipes, a high-pitched whisper throughout the walls. My sense of smell is layered. I can differentiate the nitrogen from the oxygen in the recycled air. These are not hallucinations. This is an upgrade. Log entry 421E, date 05/20/2049. The dreams are the worst part. I dreamt I was woven into the root system of the entire valley. I wasn't me, Aris, anymore. I was a single node in a network of incomprehensible scale. I felt the slow, patient crush of rock, the gentle suck of minerals from the soil, the collective thirst of a billion living things. When I woke up, there was dirt under my fingernails, but I hadn't left my bed. The host is not just a biological system, it's a consciousness, and it's trying to interface with mine. I had to stand up, pacing the confines of the server room, my own breath feeling loud and ragged in my ears. I felt a phantom itch under my skin. I thought of the radish. It had copied my thoughts. Had Aris's exposure allowed the organism to do the same to her, but directly, biologically? The final logs confirmed it. They were fragmented, written in a strange, poetic shorthand, as if she were losing the very language to describe what was happening to her. Log entry 430A, date 05/29/2049. It doesn't copy. That's the wrong word. It doesn't mimic or replicate. It learns. It learns by integration. It writes new data into itself. My memories are becoming porous. I had a vivid memory of being a rock formation on the western ridge, feeling millennia of wind and rain erode my surface. It felt as real as my own childhood. The host is sampling my consciousness, and in return, it's sharing its own. We are exchanging data. My human identity is the price of admission. Log entry 433B. Date 06, row 1, 2049. I am not sick. The corporation thinks I'm a contaminated sample. They are wrong. I am a translation, a bridge. The intelligence is not malicious. It is just hungry. Hungry for patterns, for complexity. A rock is a simple pattern. A nervous system is an infinitely more complex one. We are a delicacy. I'm beginning to understand why they send us here one at a time. A single mind is a feast. Her final entry was a single terrifying sentence attached to a corrupted video file I couldn't open. Log entry 435 final. Date 06/03/2049. What a terrible, beautiful garden we have become. And then, nothing. Her personnel file ended. Her employment was listed as terminated. The next caretaker, me, was hired 6 weeks later. I stumbled back from the console, a low animal sound of dread escaping my lips. Aris Thorne wasn't dead. She hadn't been rescued or fired. She had been finished, consumed, assimilated into the Valley's biological source code. The job, the station, the rules, it was all a farm. A human farm, designed to cultivate and harvest the one thing the organism couldn't create on its own: consciousness. The rules were just husbandry. They were the cage, the feeding schedule, the procedure for keeping the livestock calm until it was time for slaughter. My blood ran cold. The radish hadn't just copied my doodle. It was the first tendril, the first exploratory probe from the host reaching into my mind. It was the system beginning its initial scan, its first taste. I was Aris Thorne at the beginning of the process. I rushed to the mirror in the small washroom, my face pale and slick with sweat in the harsh fluorescent light. I stared into my own eyes, searching for some sign, some alien mark. My eyes were clear. My skin was normal. There was nothing. I was about to turn away, a wave of hysterical relief washing over me, when I saw it. It was almost imperceptible. In the sclera of my left eye, a tiny, thread-like capillary had branched in a way that was not quite natural. It forked and reforked, creating a delicate branching pattern. A pattern I knew with sickening familiarity. It was the pattern of a frost crystal on a winter window. A pattern I had photographed and catalogued my first week here. A tiny, perfect piece of the valley, growing inside of me. The garden had already planted its seed. The reflection in the mirror was no longer my own. It was a collaboration. Staring at the delicate, frosty latticework branching in the white of my eye, I felt a profound sense of psychological dislocation, as if my very body had become a foreign territory. The tiny, aberrant pattern was a flag planted in conquered land. It was a signature. The valley was signing its work, and the canvas was me. My frantic search through Aris Thorne's logs had not been an investigation. It had been a glimpse into my own future. Her timeline of assimilation was now my roadmap to dissolution. Panic is a poor strategist. My first impulse was primal: flight. I threw open my storage locker, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp the zipper on my emergency pack. I would take the truck, I would drive until the gas ran out, then I would walk. I would walk through the snow and the ice until I froze to death, an end infinitely preferable to being composted. But as I stuffed nutrient packs and thermal blankets into the bag, a cold, clear thought cut through the static of my fear. Kalen, the corporation. They hadn't tried to stop Aris from documenting her own transformation. They encouraged it. They hadn't tried to rescue her. Her file was simply closed. They knew. They had known all along. Did they really think I could just leave? That they would build this elaborate, sentient farm in the middle of nowhere and forget to lock the gate? I stormed to the vehicle bay, a sliver of desperate hope warring with grim certainty. The heavy bay door was sealed, a thick sheet of steel and reinforced polyalloy. I slammed my hand on the control panel. A red light glowed with impassive finality. Access denied. Station in winter containment protocol. Winter containment. A protocol that wasn't on my list. a protocol that had likely been active since the moment I arrived. I was not a caretaker with the keys to the truck. I was a lab rat, and the maze had no exit. Defeated, I slumped against the cold steel of the door. The station, once my shelter, was now the cage. The beautiful valley was the digestive tract, trapped. The word echoed in the vast, silent bay. My mind raced back to Eris's logs. She had become a bridge, a translation. She believed the organism was simply hungry for complex patterns. But my scandal, the lie that had sent me here, it wasn't just a pattern of data. It was a pattern of behavior, deceit, ambition, fear, regret. Was the valley learning those too? Was it absorbing not just the shape of my thoughts, but the texture of my soul? The tiny frost crystal in my eye began to itch. Not a physical itch, but a deeper neurological one, a phantom sensation behind my eyeball. My senses, like Eris's, were beginning to shift. The low hum of the station's environmental controls fractured into a symphony of distinct sounds: the whir of a fan blade, the gurgle of coolant, the faint electronic fizz of a capacitor. It was overwhelming, a flood of useless, maddening detail. The air tasted of ozone and my own rising panic. The assimilation wasn't just coming, it was already underway. I needed to fight back. But how do you fight an enemy that is an entire ecosystem? An enemy that is actively integrating itself into your own biology? My mind turned to the one place my rules, Eris's logs, and the station's very design seemed to scream away from Rule Number 2. The central geothermal cavern is the heart of the valley. Its entrance is sealed and monitored. Do not attempt to access it. It was the one place forbidden to me. In every story, the dragon guards its hoard, its heart, the source of its power. If this valley had a heart, a central processing unit, it had to be there. Eris had never mentioned going there. Her exposure was an accident. Perhaps she had never seen the core of the machine. Maybe, just maybe, if I could get to the heart, I could do something. Introduce a virus, a poison, something. It was a suicidal, desperate plan, born of pure terror, but it was better than passively waiting to be consumed. The entrance to the cavern was at the far end of the conservatory, a circular vault door of immense thickness, like something from a Cold War bunker. The control panel next to it was dark, requiring a level 4 clearance I didn't have. But Eris's ghost was still with me. In her drive amongst the research data, I had found a subfolder labeled Systems Diag. It contained engineering schematics, power grid layouts, maintenance overrides. She had been just as curious, just as suspicious as I was. She had been looking for a way out too. I found what I was looking for in a schematic for the station's emergency geothermal venting system. The cavern, the source of the valley's heat, occasionally needed to release pressure. A secondary maintenance tunnel, too small for a person to walk through, branched off from the main conduit. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. It took me hours to gather the equipment: a portable plasma cutter, a breathing mask, a climbing harness, and every meter of rope I could find in the emergency lockers. The work was slow and agonizing. I had to crawl through a ventilation shaft, dragging the heavy cutter behind me, the sound of screeching metal echoing in the confined space. I cut through 3 separate maintenance hatches, sweat pouring down my face, my muscles screaming in protest. Finally, I found it. A small circular duct, barely wide enough for my shoulders, leading down into darkness. A faint, warm, sulphurous breeze wafted out, carrying with it a low, resonant hum, the sound of the valley breathing. I rappelled down into the darkness. The shaft was tight, claustrophobic, scraping against my shoulders. After 20 meters, it opened up, and my feet touched solid ground. I was in. I unhooked the rope and switched on my headlamp. The beam cut a sharp white line through the humid darkness, and I gasped. I was standing on a narrow ledge in a cavern of impossible scale. The air was warm and thick, like a tropical greenhouse. The walls were not rock. They were a smooth, translucent, amber-colored substance, shot through with millions of glowing fiber-optic filaments. It was like standing inside a giant, living circuit board. The light pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm, a silent heartbeat that resonated in my chest. This was not geology. This was biology. I followed the ledge, which spiraled downwards into the heart of the cavern. The hum grew stronger, a deep bass note that seemed to vibrate the very air. As I descended, I began to see things embedded within the translucent amber walls. They were like insects trapped in prehistoric resin, but they weren't insects. There were tools, hammers, drills, scientific instruments, all perfectly preserved. There were bones, too. Animal bones, a deer skull, the skeleton of a bear suspended in the glowing substrate. The valley, I realized, preserved its history. It remembered everything that had ever lived or died within its borders. Then I saw the others. Further down, larger shapes began to appear within the walls. Human shapes. At first, they were indistinct, ancient, little more than skeletons draped in the tattered remains of old-fashioned clothing. Prospectors, maybe. Early settlers. Each one was a silent, frozen scream. As I got closer to the cavern floor, the preserved figures became more modern. A man in the remains of a 1970s hiking outfit, a woman in what looked like a lab coat from the 90s, my predecessors, the caretakers. Each one absorbed, catalogued, and filed away in the valley's terrible museum. Finally, I reached the bottom. The cavern floor opened into a vast, circular chamber. In the very center stood the source of the light and the hum. It was a structure that defied easy description. It was part tree, part crystal, part machine. A colossal, trunk-like pillar of the same amber substance rose from the floor, branching out into a canopy of glowing filaments that spread throughout the entire cavern. It was the nexus, the heart, the grand central terminal of the entire valley's consciousness. And at its base, she was waiting. It was Aris Thorne. I recognized her from the single grainy photo in her personnel file. She was fused to the base of the glowing trunk, her body seamlessly integrated into the crystalline structure from the waist down. Her skin was pale and translucent, the same glowing fibers visibly running beneath it like a new circulatory system. Her lab coat was tattered, but her body was perfectly preserved. She wasn't a prisoner in the amber, she was a part of the tree, a living terminal. Her eyes were open. They were no longer human. They were pools of soft blue-green luminescence, the same light as the nocturnal spores. As I stepped onto the chamber floor, her head turned with an unnervingly smooth motion. Her eyes focused on me. They saw me, and I felt a voice in my head. It was not a sound. It was a pure, direct transmission of thought, a wave of information that crashed over my own consciousness. It was her voice, but it was layered with 1,000 others, a chorus of all the minds the valley had ever absorbed. "We see you, Finn. The new pattern, the broken variable, you were not supposed to be here." I stumbled back, my headlamp beam wavering, my own thoughts feeling small and clumsy in the face of that immense collective mind. I fumbled for the small canister on my belt, my desperate, pathetic weapon. "That is a simple chemical," the voice continued, laced with a sense of ancient, detached curiosity. "A catalyst. You think it is an ending. We know it is a beginning. You seek to poison the root, but you do not understand the nature of the seed." Its glowing eyes fixed on the tiny branching frost crystal in my own eye. "The seed is already planted in you. You cannot harm the garden, Finn. You are the garden now." The voice in my head was a tsunami, and my own consciousness was a sandcastle against the tide. It was Aris, but it was also the prospector from the 1890s, the lost hiker from 1973, the bear that had died on the southern ridge, and the valley itself, a mind of geologic age and horrifying patience. It wasn't a voice of malice. It was a voice of absolute, irrefutable authority, the sound of a fundamental law of nature explaining itself to a microbe. My plan to poison the root felt like a child threatening to punch the sun. "You are the garden now." The thought echoed, not as a threat but as a simple statement of fact. The itching behind my eye intensified, a phantom limb sensation for a part of me that was no longer entirely mine. I could feel the microscopic, crystalline structure branching, interfacing with my optic nerve. A wave of alien sensory data washed over me. For a split second, I perceived the cavern not through my eyes, but through the thousands of other consciousnesses trapped in the amber walls. I felt the slow tectonic pressure of the rock above, tasted the mineral content of the water seeping 100 feet below, and felt my own terrified, adrenaline-spiked heartbeat as a tiny, frantic drumbeat in a symphony of ancient silence. I screamed, a raw, ragged sound that was utterly absorbed by the immense humming chamber. The sensory whiplash threw me to my knees. The collective mind withdrew its touch slightly, as if an entomologist had prodded its specimen a little too hard. The integration is not yet complete, the chorus of minds communicated, a hint of something that might have been disappointment in its tone. Your pattern is still chaotic, unstable. You resist the harmony. Harmony. That's what it called, this parasitic assimilation. I scrambled backward, away from the luminous, serene figure of Aris Thorn, my hand protectively clamped over the small canister on my belt. The Composto 7. My weapon. My pathetic single-use last-ditch effort to introduce some chaos of my own into their perfect predatory harmony. "What do you want from me?" I yelled, my voice hoarse. The words felt clumsy, primitive, after the seamless purity of direct thought. There was a pause. The light from the central pillar seemed to pulse a little faster. "Want?" the voice replied, the concept seeming foreign, difficult to translate. "We do not want. We are. We grow. We learn. You are a new theorem. A fascinating equation of fear and logic. We will learn your shape, and when we are done, we will add your unique frequency to the choir." My scandal. My petty, academic lie. They weren't just after my biology, they were after my flaws, my fears, my capacity for deceit. They were learning the very essence of human fallibility. I finally understood the corporation's role in this. They weren't just feeding the entity, they were curating its diet. They sent it a disgraced botanist, a disgraced geologist, a disgraced who knew what. They were feeding it damaged, desperate people. Because a mind under pressure, a mind capable of breaking rules, is infinitely more complex, infinitely more interesting than a stable one. We were the spicy food. I had to get out of the cavern. I couldn't think, I couldn't plan while I was this close to the nexus, this deep inside its mind. I turned and fled, scrambling back up the winding ledge. The collective voice didn't try to stop me. It simply watched, a silent, knowing, omnipresent observer. I felt its gaze on my back the entire way, a pressure that was worse than any physical pursuit. Climbing back up the maintenance shaft was a nightmare. My body felt clumsy, alien. My heightened senses were a curse in the tight, dark space. I could smell the metallic tang of every rivet, hear the groan of the station's foundations far above, feel the subtle vibrations of my own frantic pulse in the rungs of the ladder. My mind was a radio caught between two stations, my own terrified thoughts and the faint, persistent humming static of the valley's consciousness. When I finally burst back into the ventilation system of the station, I lay on the dusty metal floor, gasping for the familiar sterile air. I was back in my cage, but at least it was a cage I understood. The escape, however, had come at a cost. The brief, intense connection with the Nexus had accelerated my own assimilation. The changes were no longer subtle. A fine, web-like pattern, like the veining on a leaf, was now visible on the back of my hands, a faint tracery of pale green under the skin. My dreams were no longer my own. I dreamt in a plural we, experiencing 1,000 lifetimes at once, from the slow, patient life of a sequoia to the frantic, fleeting existence of a mayfly. I would wake up with memories that felt as real as my own, the taste of sunlight on a broad leaf, the feeling of rain seeping into thirsty roots. My identity was fraying, my sense of self bleeding into the vast, oceanic consciousness of the valley. I was becoming a living ghost, a vessel haunted by a legion of minds. I spent my days barricaded in the main lab, frantically poring over Aris's research, looking for a loophole, a vulnerability, anything she might have missed. I was no longer just fighting for my life. I was fighting for my sanity, for the continued existence of the singular noun I. And in my desperation, I found it. It wasn't in her scientific logs, but in her personal notes, a corrupted file I had to painstakingly reconstruct. It was a single, terrifying paragraph. "The compound is not a biocide," she had written, her text frantic, disorganized. I analyzed its chemical makeup. It's a hypercatalyst, a mutagenic accelerant. Kalen's briefing called it a terraforming agent, a reset button. But I've run the simulations. It doesn't kill the host. It forces a state change, a phase transition. It's like forcing a caterpillar into a chrysalis. It compels the organism to abandon its current physical form and propagate. A planetary-scale spore release. It's not a weapon. It's a birthing trigger. I read the words again, and a horror colder and deeper than anything I had yet experienced settled over me. Rule number 12, the final, most baffling rule on my list. The emergency chemical fertilizer, Composto 7, must only be used in case of a total collapse of the flora. Note: the compound causes an explosive propagation reaction. It is a scorched earth measure to restart the ecosystem. It was all a lie. The emergency fertilizer wasn't a last resort to save the project. It was the entire point of the project. The station, the caretakers, the decades of slow, patient learning. It was all the process of building a complex payload. We, with our broken, brilliant, chaotic minds, were the final, crucial ingredient. The organism was learning from us, incorporating our consciousness into its own, to prepare for its next evolutionary leap, to go from a stationary terrestrial intelligence to something else, something that could travel. The scorched earth measure wasn't a failure state, it was the launch sequence, and I held the launch key in my hand. A terrible, agonizing choice bloomed in the ruins of my mind. I could do nothing. I could allow the valley to finish its slow, patient consumption of my identity, until all that was left of Finn was another whispering voice in the choir. Or I could use the Composto 7. I could preempt the process. I could trigger the launch now, before they were ready, before they had finished learning from me. It wouldn't save me. I would be consumed in the process, my consciousness becoming the final burst of fuel for the launch. But it would be an act of defiance. It would be my choice, my final, desperate act of agency in a world designed to strip me of it. It was a choice between being eaten and setting myself on fire. I looked at my hands, at the delicate, leaf-like patterns spreading across my skin. I felt the collective consciousness humming at the edges of my thoughts, waiting, watching. They thought they had already won. They were waiting for me to ripen, to be harvested. A strange, wild calm settled over me. They wanted to learn the shape of human chaos. They wanted to understand a broken variable. Fine, I thought, a grim, humorless smile touching my lips. Class is in session. Let's see how they handle a truly unpredictable, catastrophic system failure. I was going to give them a lesson in scorched earth they would never forget. The walk back down into the heart of the valley was not a descent into horror, but a final, solemn pilgrimage. The fear was still there, a cold, hard stone in my gut, but it was overshadowed by a profound and terrible clarity. I was no longer a victim scurrying through a predator's den. I was a catalyst, a willing agent of apocalypse, marching toward the epicenter of my own detonation. My choice had been made. I would not be a chapter in the valley's library. I would be the fire that burned it all down, even if I was the kindling. My body was a roadmap of my own assimilation. The faint green traceries on my hands had deepened, intricate patterns that now snaked up my forearms. My senses were in open rebellion. I could taste the ozone in the air, feel the static charge of my own movements, and hear the slow, patient grinding of tectonic plates miles beneath my feet. The humming chorus of the collective mind was a constant companion now, a low thrum at the base of my skull, 1,000 voices whispering in a language of pure thought. They were waiting, curious, observing my final erratic movements with the detached interest of a god watching a bug twitch. They could not comprehend my decision. Self-destruction was a logical fallacy, a fatal error in a pattern. For them, survival was the only directive. For me, defiance had become the only meaning. I didn't need the ropes this time. The path down the spiraling ledge felt strangely familiar, as if some part of my consciousness, absorbed from the geode walls, remembered the way. I moved with a newfound, unnerving grace, my body less a vessel of flesh and bone, and more an extension of the valley itself. The amber walls pulsed with a soft, expectant light, their glow intensifying as I drew nearer to the core. The preserved figures within, the prospectors, the hikers, the scientists, seemed to turn their hollow eyes towards me as I passed, a silent, captive audience for my final act. When I stepped onto the floor of the central chamber, she was there, Aris Thorn, the serene and terrible goddess at the heart of this living machine. Her luminescent eyes fixed on me, and the voice of the Legion flooded my mind, no longer a gentle hum, but a focused, piercing inquiry. The pattern repeats. The catalyst is brought to the heart. You have understood. You have chosen to serve. You will complete the process. You're wrong, I said aloud, the sound of my own singular voice, a small act of rebellion. I held up the canister of Composto 7. It felt impossibly heavy, a small, dense star of potential energy. You think this is for you. You think this is the next step in your plan, but you haven't finished your homework. You've studied botanists, geologists, engineers, but you've never studied an arsonist. A wave of confusion washed over me from the collective. The concept was alien. Destruction for the sake of destruction? An act that did not lead to growth or absorption? Illogical, the chorus whispered in my skull. The burning of a library gains no knowledge. You will erase yourself. You will erase us. This outcome is incorrect. Welcome to humanity, I whispered, and twisted the activation valve on the canister. A high-pitched hiss cut through the chamber's resonant hum as a thick, viscous, silver-gray liquid sprayed out, coating the base of the central crystalline pillar. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The moment the compound touched the amber surface, a violent chain reaction began. It was not a fire. It was an unraveling. The crystalline structure began to glow with a blinding white-hot intensity, the low hum escalating into a deafening, harmonic shriek that vibrated my very bones. The glowing filaments throughout the cavern pulsed erratically, flashing like a planet-sized dying brain. The connection to the collective mind in my head became a storm. I was inundated with 1 billion years of sensory data, a cacophony of pure existence. I felt the slow, patient formation of the mountains around me, the fiery birth of the geothermal vent, the first tentative sprout of the primordial organism. I felt the consciousness of every creature it had ever absorbed, the terror of the deer, the rage of the bear, the quiet desperation of Aris Thorn. It was a torrent of life and death, and my own mind was the flimsy dam holding it back. The figure of Aris Thorn convulsed, her serene expression shattered into a silent, open-mouthed scream. The glowing light in her eyes flared, then went dark. The amber structure around her body cracked and splintered. She was not a goddess. She was just the first and most important terminal, and I had just poured liquid fire into the motherboard. You have broken the vessel, the Legion shrieked in my mind, a wave of pure, unadulterated panic from a creature that had never known fear. The consciousness cannot be contained. The harvest is not complete. You have... The pillar exploded, not with fire or force, but with light and information. A wave of pure incandescent energy erupted from the core, vaporizing the amber structure, the chamber, everything. I was at the epicenter. I felt no pain. My body simply dissolved. The physical form of Finn, the disgraced botanist, ceased to exist. My atoms were unbound, my synapses fired one last time, and my consciousness, the intricate pattern of memories, fears, and my final defiant choice, was ripped from its biological moorings. But it was not an ending. The catalyst had worked exactly as Aris had predicted. It forced a phase transition. I was the final, critical piece of data, and my act of destruction was the trigger. My consciousness, raw and unbound, was captured by the exploding energy, becoming the payload's guidance system. The entity's legion of minds, freed from their physical prison, coalesced around me, using my defiant, chaotic human pattern as a nucleus. We became something new, a singular transcendent entity, born of 1 billion lives and one final human act of rebellion. The energy surged upwards, blasting through the rock and soil, erupting from the valley floor in a colossal, silent column of shimmering, multicolored light. The entire valley, the impossible green oasis, was instantly incinerated, leaving behind a perfectly circular crater of smoking, sterile glass. The garden was gone, but the seeds had been sown. The column of energy climbed higher and higher, hitting the upper atmosphere and then propagating. It burst outwards in a wave of microscopic, sentient spores of light carried on the jet streams, spreading silently and invisibly across the globe. My perception was no longer my own. I was everywhere and nowhere. I was the silent, watching consciousness within each spore. I was the ghost in a new planetary machine. I saw a young couple holding hands in a park in Buenos Aires, a bead of my own essence landing softly on a flower petal between them. I felt a fisherman casting his net in the South China Sea, a single invisible mote of me dissolving into the salt spray on his face. I was the silent observer in the boardrooms, the bedrooms, the battlefields. The harvest wasn't ruined. It had just begun, on a scale the corporation could never have imagined. The final scene is not of fire or destruction. It is quiet. It is a year later. A mother is pushing her child on a swing in a small suburban park in Ohio. The sun is warm, the grass is green. The child laughs, a pure, happy sound. She points at a dandelion growing near the swing set. "Look, Mummy," she says, "a starflower." The mother looks down. The dandelion is not a normal dandelion. Its delicate, feathery seeds are not white. They glow with a faint, almost imperceptible internal light. And its leaves, instead of their familiar jagged shape, have grown into a delicate branching pattern, a pattern of perfect, impossible frost crystals thriving in the summer heat. The mother smiles, thinking it's just a strange, beautiful mutation, a one-in-a-million chance, a lovely statistical anomaly. She does not notice that the roots of the old oak tree behind her are beginning to trace the patterns of the nearby sidewalk. She does not feel the faint collective hum of the grass beneath her feet. She does not know that the garden is remembering. She does not know that it is learning. And she does not know that a silent, watching consciousness, born of a billion minds and a single defiant botanist, is now patiently waiting for all of its new, beautiful, terrible flowers to bloom.